She spent 3 years loving a man who was counting down the days until someone better came along. Madeline Carter didn't see it coming. Not the laughter, not the cruelty, not the way his voice dropped when he said her name like it was something to be ashamed of. One rainy Tuesday night in Chicago, she walked into a restaurant carrying an anniversary gift and walked out carrying nothing but the wreckage of everything she thought was real. But the same night, Ethan Calloway destroyed her world. Fate dropped a dying man at her feet who would rebuild it. Hit-like. Drop your city below. Stay until the end. But The rain came in sideways off Lake Michigan, the kind that didn't care about umbrellas or intentions. It hammered the awnings along West Randolph Street and pooled in the gutters and made the whole city look like it was dissolving at the edges. Madeline Carter walked through it anyway, her shift bag slung over one shoulder, a small wrapped box tucked under her arm, her sneakers soaked through before she'd made it half a block from the parking garage. She hadn't changed out of her scrubs. She'd meant to. She'd packed a dress, a real one. The dark green wrap she'd bought on sale 2 months ago and saved specifically for tonight. But the ER had handed her a 14-hour shift that bled into 15, and by the time she clocked out, she had 40 minutes and no energy left for transformation. So she'd wiped the worst of the day off her face in the hospital bathroom, pulled her hair out of its elastic, and told herself Ethan wouldn't care. 3 years. He knew what her job looked like. He knew who she was. The restaurant was called Arlo's, tucked into the ground floor of a converted loft building on the near west side. It wasn't the kind of place Madeline would have chosen. The lighting was architectural rather than warm, all exposed Edison bulbs and reclaimed wood, and a bar menu that described cocktails in full paragraphs. Ethan had picked it. Ethan always picked. He had opinions about restaurants the way he had opinions about everything, firmly and slightly annoyed if you disagreed. She spotted his car in the lot, the black Audi, freshly detailed even in this weather. She'd always found that mildly strange, the way he took his car through the wash every Tuesday, regardless of forecast, the way certain things about his appearance demanded maintenance that her things never did. Her car had a crack in the dashboard she'd been meaning to fix for 8 months. Her winter coat still had the coffee stain from last February. She'd never thought much about the difference, but standing on the sidewalk in wet scrubs holding a gift she'd wrapped herself with the tape running crooked along one edge, she felt it for the first time as a gap rather than just a detail. She pushed through the front door. The hostess stand was unmanned. The bar crowd was thin. A Wednesday, early still, most of the after-work energy not yet built. Madeline scanned the room and found Ethan at a corner table near the back, not alone. He had 2 colleagues with her, men she recognized vaguely from the firm holiday party, both in their mid-30s, both wearing that particular brand of expensive casual that said, "I could have worn a suit but chose not to." Ethan was leaning back in his chair, jacket off, a glass of something amber in his hand, and he was laughing. She moved toward him. She was maybe 12 feet away, close enough to hear the conversation, but not yet visible from where he sat, when she heard her own name. "Madeline actually thinks tonight is a big deal," Ethan was saying. He shook his head with a kind of fond exhaustion, like someone describing a pet that had done something mildly embarrassing. 3 years. She's been dropping hints about rings for 6 months. One of the men, the broader one, dark hair, loosened tie, raised his glass. "So what's the plan?" "The plan," Ethan said, and he took a slow drink before he finished, "is to let her enjoy the evening, keep things comfortable." "You're not going to—" "No." The word was flat and final. "I'm not proposing to Madeline." The rain outside seemed to get louder. Or maybe Madeline had just stopped hearing everything else. "Never?" the second man asked. Ethan made a small sound, something between a laugh and a sigh. "Look, she's a good person, she's reliable, she's there." He turned the glass in his hand. "But she's a nurse from Oak Park whose idea of a big weekend is a brunch reservation and an HGTV marathon. I'm going to be a named partner. I have clients now who summer in the Hamptons." He paused. "Madeline doesn't fit that picture." "So you're just—" "I'm comfortable," he said. "For now. She's easy to be with. She never makes demands, never causes scenes, always available when I need her." A beat. "But I never loved her. Not really. I don't think I was capable of it with her." She didn't move. She stood there in her wet scrubs with her crooked taped gift, and the rain dripping from her hair onto the restaurant floor, and she let every single syllable of that sentence land exactly where it was aimed. I never loved her. Not past tense, the way a man might confess to having outgrown something. Present, declarative, like a fact about the weather. The broader man leaned forward. Man, she doesn't know any of this? Of course not. Ethan drained his glass. She thinks I'm the problem, that I'm scared of commitment. It's easier that way. Madeline turned around. She walked back through the restaurant the same way she'd come in, past the hostess stand, through the front door, back into the rain. She didn't run. Running would have required more feeling than she had access to at that exact moment. What she felt instead was a strange clarity, the way she sometimes felt at the tail end of a code, after the chest compressions and the epinephrine and the 3 rounds of defibrillation, when the monitor went flat and everything in the room went very quiet, and you just stood there understanding something essential about the world's willingness to end things without warning or apology. She sat in her car for a while. The gift was still under her arm. She set it on the passenger seat without looking at it. She didn't cry. Not yet. The crying would come later at 2 a.m. in her apartment when the adrenaline wore off and there was nothing left between her and the reality of it. But right now she sat in the parking lot of Arlo's with the rain hammering the roof of her car, and she thought very clearly, 3 years. She'd rearranged her schedule for him. She'd skipped her cousin's wedding because he'd had a client dinner. She'd eaten dinner alone more nights than she could count because his hours were unpredictable. And she'd told herself that was fine because she understood demanding work. She did demanding work. They were both serious people building serious lives. She had believed that story completely. She never makes demands. The thing that broke her wasn't the betrayal. The thing that broke her was how accurately he'd described her. Not out of cruelty, out of simple observation. She had made herself so accommodating, so low maintenance, so permanently available, that in 3 years she had never once made him feel anything she hadn't carefully modulated first. She had loved him so quietly that he hadn't heard it as love. He'd heard it as convenience. She texted him from the parking lot. No explanation, no confrontation. She was too tired for confrontation, and she already knew what he would do. He would come outside and find her in the car, and the look on his face wouldn't be guilt. It would be calculation. How much does she know? How do I manage this? She didn't want to watch him calculate. I heard you. We're done. Don't call me. She turned off her phone before she pulled out of the lot. Her apartment was on the north side, a third-floor walk-up in Andersonville with radiator heat that clanged in the winter, and a bathroom tile she'd been planning to replace since she moved in. It had good light in the morning, and a narrow balcony that fit 1 chair, and a small pot of herbs she kept optimistically alive through most of the year. She'd always thought of it as temporary, the kind of place you lived before your life assembled itself into its real shape. She hadn't examined too closely what shape she'd been waiting for. She poured a glass of wine she didn't drink. She sat at her kitchen table in her wet scrubs and looked at the middle distance and let the night do whatever it needed to do to her. At some point she moved to the couch. At some point the wine went warm. At some point, around 1 a.m., she opened Ethan's Instagram and scrolled through it with a detachment that surprised her. The professional headshots, the restaurant check-ins, the occasional photo of the two of them from early in the relationship when he'd still bothered to post, his arm around her shoulders, both of them squinting into a summer sunset. He looked happy in those photos. So did she. She put the phone down and finally cried. Not dramatically, just steadily, the way the rain had been coming down all night, like something that needed to get done and was going to take as long as it took. She was back at the hospital by 6 a.m. That was the thing about the ER. It didn't wait for you to be ready. The world maintained its emergencies on a schedule that had nothing to do with your personal circumstances, and Madeline had always found a strange relief in that. The moment she crossed through the ambulance bay doors, the particular flavor of her own grief became temporarily irrelevant. There were people here who needed the kind of help that Ethan Calloway could not provide and that her heartbreak could not diminish. She was good at her job in the specific way that some people were, not because she'd chosen it abstractly as a career, but because the work had chosen her in the way that the work sometimes chose people, by revealing to them the only version of themselves that felt completely functional. The day was brutal. A multi-vehicle on the I-90 connector sent 4 patients through the doors before 9. A pediatric case that she couldn't stop thinking about even now. A cardiac event that they caught barely in time. She moved through all of it with the steady economy of motion that came from years of doing exactly this. And if anyone noticed that her eyes were slightly swollen or that she was quieter than usual, nobody said anything. That was another mercy the ER provided. Everyone was too busy to notice the things you needed them not to notice. By 11 p.m., she had 9 hours on her feet and was charting the last of her notes at the nurse's station when the radio crackled. Trauma incoming, GSW, multiple, ETA 4 minutes, level 1. She was already moving. The ambulance came in hot, back doors crashing open before it had fully stopped. The paramedics already doing compressions on a man who was doing a poor job of remaining alive. Madeline registered the details in her professional shorthand as they wheeled him through. Male, maybe mid-40s, dark hair matted with blood, expensive clothes destroyed by trauma shears, BP dropping, O negative already hung, 2 gunshot wounds visible from her position, possibly more. The paramedic rattling stats at her was using the particular tone that meant, "He is on the edge, and we cannot tell you which way this is going." She ran beside the gurney. "What do we know?" "Found in an alley off South Michigan. Anonymous call. No ID on the scene. Somebody cleaned him out before we got there." The paramedic shook his head. "Except for these guys." He meant the 4 men who had arrived in 2 separate vehicles and were now standing inside the ambulance bay, none of them in scrubs, none of them patients. Big men, watchful. The kind of stillness on them that wasn't calm so much as coiled. 2 of them had their hands near their hips in a way that Madeline noticed without dwelling on, because she had a patient who was 30 seconds from exsanguinating, and that was what mattered. "Room 3, she said. They worked on him for 40 minutes. It was not clean or elegant. It was the kind of trauma work that reminded you. The human body was simultaneously a remarkable piece of engineering and an extraordinarily fragile one. That the difference between living and dying could hinge on the width of a surgical instrument, the timing of a single decision, the experience of the person standing at the table. Madeline was that person tonight. The attending, Dr. Reyes, was managing 2 other critical cases and had handed her primary responsibility with the kind of nod that meant you've done this before, don't lose him. She didn't lose him. When his BP stabilized and Reyes came in to close, she stepped back from the table and let herself breathe for the first time in 40 minutes. Her gloves were soaked through. Her hands were shaking faintly. Not from fear, just from the particular metabolic cost of that level of sustained focus. The way the body sends the bill once the crisis passes. She stripped her gloves and walked out into the hallway. The 4 men from the ambulance bay were there. They'd been moved inside by security, which meant security had decided that moving them inside was the safer option, which told Madeline something about the nature of the negotiation that had taken place. One of them stepped toward her immediately, 50s, silver hair at the temples, a suit that had cost more than her monthly rent. He had the eyes of a man who had spent decades watching other men and calculating risk. "How is he?" the man said. It wasn't a question. "Stable. We're not out of the woods yet, but he's stable." She kept her voice level. "Who is he?" The man studied her for a moment. "His name is Vincent." "Last name?" Something moved across the man's face. Not exactly reluctance, more like assessment. He was deciding how much she needed to know and what knowing it would cost. "Moretti," he said. She knew the name. You couldn't work an ER in Chicago's south-facing corridor for 6 years and not know the name Moretti. You heard it in certain police conversations that happened at low volume near the coffee machine. You heard it in the occasional patient who came in with injuries that had a very specific pattern and who answered your questions with monosyllables and left without filing reports. Vincent Moretti was not a rumor. He was a fact, the way certain weather systems were facts, real, documented, and capable of significant damage. She looked at the man with the silver hair. "He's my patient," she said. "That's all I need to know." She walked back into room 3. Over the next 6 hours, the floor around Vincent Moretti's room acquired a quiet, persistent tension that everyone on shift could feel, but no one addressed directly. There were always at least 2 of the men visible from the nurse's station, positioned near the room's entrance and at the elevator bank, not overtly aggressive but not absent either. Madeline's charge nurse, a 20-year veteran named Paulette, who had treated everyone from politicians to gang members without losing her institutional authority, simply rerouted foot traffic and told the men that visiting hours were suspended until morning and that she would personally remove anyone who disagreed. They didn't disagree. They moved 6 inches to the left and stayed. Madeline checked on Vincent at 4 a.m. He was awake. She hadn't expected that. Patients coming out of that level of trauma were usually still blurred by anesthesia, by medication, by the body's own defensive processing. But his eyes were open, and they tracked her when she came through the door. And there was a focus in them that didn't match a man who'd been on the table 4 hours ago. She went through the routine. BP, pulse, the standard inventory. He watched her work without speaking. His face was sharp-boned and not conventionally handsome. A nose that had been broken at least once, a jaw that was blunt and hard, a scar along the left side of his neck that was old and probably didn't come from anything clinical. He looked like a man who had been built specifically for the kind of life he led. "Hurt," he said. One word, testing the machinery of it. "Yes," she said. "You were shot twice. You have a repaired arterial bleed, and you're lucky to have a working cardiovascular system. So I'd appreciate it if you didn't make any sudden movements for the next 24 hours. He looked at her for a moment. Then, "You're the one who—" "I was in the room, yes." "How bad?" "Bad enough that this conversation is a minor miracle." She noted his BP, which was low but holding. "Don't push it." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was rough and deliberate. "I don't remember asking to come here." "Your associates made that decision for you. You were unconscious." "Dominic," he said, and it wasn't exactly gratitude. "That was the man's name? Silver hair?" "Yes." "He made the right call." Another silence. Vincent Moretti looked at the ceiling for a while, and Madeline finished her charting and capped her pen, and was about to leave when he said quietly and without inflection, "You're not afraid of me." She considered that. "I'm a nurse. You're my patient. Fear is not a useful clinical tool." "Most people? I'm not most people," she said, "and you're not most patients. Get some sleep." She left the room without looking back. In the hallway, Paulette appeared at her elbow. "Girl, I know." "You know who that is." "I know who that is." "And you're just—" "Paulette." Madeline looked at her. "He came in with 2 gunshots and a destroyed arterial wall, and we fixed it. That's the job. I'm going to do the job." Paulette studied her for a long moment, with the particular expression of a woman who had seen everything and still retained the capacity to be impressed by certain varieties of stubbornness. Then she shook her head and walked back to the station. Madeline leaned against the wall for a moment, alone in the corridor with the fluorescent hum, and the distant sound of monitors, and the particular 4 a.m. quality of a hospital that had not slept. Her chest ached, not from fear, not from adrenaline, from the strange pressure of a day that had started with Ethan's voice in a restaurant and ended here, in this hallway, with the most dangerous man in Chicago sleeping behind the door 3 feet from her back, still alive because she'd done her job, and the anniversary gift she'd left in her car still wrapped in its crooked tape, going undelivered. She had spent 3 years trying to earn something that was never on offer. She pushed off the wall and went back to work. What she didn't know, standing in that fluorescent hallway at 4 in the morning, was that Vincent Moretti was still awake, that he had been listening to the sound of her footsteps retreating down the corridor, that men in his position, men who had built survival systems out of attention and calculation, did not forget the people who showed them something they hadn't expected. He had expected fear. He had expected the particular professional distance that people maintained around him, the subtle widening of the eyes, the shifted body language, the way conversations became slightly too careful in his presence. She had given him none of that. She had given him BP readings and blunt assessments and a directive to get some sleep, delivered in the tone of a woman who had decided he was worth the effort and was therefore going to apply the effort without ceremony or apology. He stared at the ceiling in the dark room and thought about that. He did not know, in that moment, the name of the man who had broken her. He did not know about the restaurant or the rain or the crooked-taped gift. He did not know that she had spent 3 years being adequately valued and not one day being seen. He would learn all of it, eventually, with the thoroughness that characterized everything he turned his attention to. He would learn it and sit with it for a long time before deciding what to do with the knowledge. But that was later. Right now, he was a man with 2 repaired gunshot wounds and a BP of 88/60 lying in a hospital bed at 4 in the morning, thinking about a nurse who wasn't afraid of him, which, in the 51 years of Vincent Moretti's life, was more remarkable than anything that had ever put him in a hospital bed. Down the hall, Madeline poured herself a terrible cup of coffee from the station machine and drank it standing up. Her phone had 43 unread texts from Ethan, which she had not opened. She imagined him at home, awake, cycling through the stages. Anger first, probably, the instinct to reframe her departure as an overreaction. Then, the calculation. Then, once he'd calculated, the carefully worded reach-out designed to give him maximum options. She turned the phone face down on the counter. The ER was quiet for the first time in 16 hours. Somewhere in the city, the rain was still falling, though you couldn't hear it from here. The fluorescent lights did what they always did, rendered everything in terms of clinical necessity, stripped away the soft ambiguities of other kinds of light, made the work visible and the world outside temporarily irrelevant. Madeline picked up the next chart. She was still at the nurse's station an hour later when the monitor in room 3 went off. Not the alarm pattern of acute distress, but the steadier notification of shifting vitals. She was through the door in seconds, and Vincent was trying to sit up, and the look on his face was not pain exactly, but something adjacent to it. The look of a man whose body was staging a revolt against a level of stillness he did not consider acceptable. "Don't," she said. You need to not rip out the repair we spent 40 minutes making." She put a hand flat against his shoulder, not hard, but present. "Whatever it is can wait." He looked at her hand, then at her face. There was something in his expression she couldn't fully name. Not resistance, not acquiescence, but a kind of recalibration, like a man deciding, in real time, to accept a set of rules he wouldn't normally accept from anyone. "Fine," he said. She adjusted the IV drip. She checked the site. She was doing the absolutely routine mechanics of patient care in the close quarters of a hospital room at 5 a.m., and yet something in the air of the room had a quality she couldn't account for. A different kind of quiet than the rest of the ward, denser somehow, more charged. She told herself it was the circumstance. The men outside, the name on the chart. She was almost back to the door when he said, "What's your name?" She paused. "Carter. Madeline Carter. You've been here all night. It's my shift. You worked on me for 40 minutes, yes. And we're going to have a real conversation about your diet and your blood pressure when you're well enough to be lectured at." She turned. "But not now." A pause. Then, for the first time, something that might have been a very slight upward adjustment at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The architecture of one. "Lecturing criminals on their blood pressure," he said. "Brave." "Efficient," she said. "There's a difference." She left the room. In the corridor, she stopped walking and stood very still for 3 seconds. Then she rolled her shoulders back and went to check on her other patients. She had 7 hours left in her shift. She had not slept. She had a ruined relationship evaporating somewhere behind her and a dangerous man recovering in room 3 and 43 unread texts from a man who had described her as convenient. She had work. That was enough. It was always enough. She would let it be enough until something better came along. She didn't know yet that it already had. The 7 remaining hours of her shift passed the way the worst hours always did. Not slowly, but with a kind of compressed density, each task folding into the next without pause, the work filling every available space the way water fills a container, leaving no room for anything else. Madeline checked vitals, updated charts, managed a diabetic patient in Bay 2 who'd come in at 6 with a foot infection that had turned septic overnight, and answered the same question from the overnight intern 3 times without letting her voice sharpen. She was good at that, controlling what came out of her, calibrating it, making sure the transmission matched the intended signal. She'd been doing it her whole adult life without noticing how much effort it required. At 7:15, she stopped outside room 3 and looked through the small reinforced window in the door. Vincent was awake again. He was propped slightly higher than she'd left him, and one of the men, not Dominic, a younger one, dark jacket, hands folded in his lap, was seated in the chair by the window, speaking to him in a low voice. Vincent was listening with the stillness of a man who processed information by letting it settle rather than reacting to it in real time. His face gave nothing away. Even post-surgery, even with the IV line and the oxygen sat monitor clipped to his finger and the general indignity of a hospital gown, there was something about the way he occupied space that didn't suggest diminishment. She pushed through the door. The young man in the chair stood immediately. Not aggressively, more the instinct of someone trained to come to their feet when certain things entered a room. He looked at Madeline and then at Vincent, and Vincent made a minimal gesture with 2 fingers, and the man nodded and left without a word. "Morning," Madeline said. "Is it?" 7:20. She moved to the monitor, ran the standard check. His BP had come up overnight, still low, but no longer alarming. Color was better. The particular gray quality that trauma patients carried in the first hours after stabilization had receded somewhat. "You slept." "Some. More than some based on these readings." She noted the chart. "How's the pain?" "Manageable." Scale of 1 to 10. He looked at her with the flatness that suggested he found the scale inadequate to the situation. 4, he said. "That's a lie." Something shifted in his face. 6. "Better." She adjusted the morphine drip by a marginal increment, enough to take the edge off without dropping his pressure further. "You're going to need a surgical consult this afternoon. The repair we did last night was emergency work. Dr. Reyes will want to look at it properly once you're more stable." "How long?" "In the hospital? Minimum 72 hours. Realistically 5 days depending on how the repair holds." She capped her pen. "I know that's not what you want to hear." "No. What you want and what your vascular system require are currently in conflict, Mr. Moretti. Your vascular system wins." He studied her for a moment. There was something assessing in it, not hostile but precise, the way a man looked at something he was trying to accurately understand. "You always talk to patients like this." "Like what?" "Like you've already decided not to be intimidated and you're just waiting for us to catch up." Madeline looked at him steadily. "I talk to patients the way the situation requires. You require directness." She picked up the chart. "Your associates are going to want to move you to a private facility. They mentioned it to my charge nurse this morning." And I'd strongly advise against it for at least 48 hours. The repair's holding, but it hasn't set. Any significant movement before then increases the risk of rebleed, and a rebleed in a private facility without a surgical team on immediate standby kills you. She met his eyes. "That's not a recommendation. That's a fact." Vincent was quiet for a moment. Then, "Dominic said you saved my life." "My team saved your life. I was part of the team. He said you were the one who made the call on the arterial bleed, that Reyes wasn't in the room yet." She didn't answer that directly. "We did our jobs." Madeline. Her name in his voice was different from how it sounded anywhere else. Flatter. More deliberate. Like he was weighing it. She felt the oddness of it but didn't let it land on her face. "Thank you," he said. It was not delivered with warmth. It was delivered with the precision of a man who meant exactly what he said, and nothing more and nothing less. And Madeline found that she trusted that more than she would have trusted elaborate sentiment. "You're welcome," she said. "Don't undo it." She left. Ethan called at 8 a.m. She was in the parking garage, scrubs changed, bag over her shoulder, standing in the gray concrete light between her car and the elevator when the phone buzzed in her hand and his name appeared on the screen, and she felt, not grief exactly, not anymore. Something more like the specific fatigue of a problem that had already been solved but was still making noise. She let it go to voicemail. She drove home through morning traffic, all the rivers of commuters heading in the opposite direction, and she cracked her window despite the cold because the air in the car felt thick and she needed something to move. Her apartment was exactly as she'd left it, the undrunk wine, the couch cushions still bearing the impression from last night, her running shoes by the door in their chronic state of waiting. She looked at the wrapped gift sitting on the kitchen counter where she'd put it without thinking when she'd come home to change. She picked it up and put it in the recycling bin. She slept for 5 hours. When she woke up, the voicemail light was blinking. She listened to it standing in the kitchen in yesterday's t-shirt, eating crackers because eating required more initiative than she currently had. Madeline. Ethan's voice, careful. Not the voice he used in public or with clients. The other one, the more considered register he deployed when he needed something. I don't know exactly what you heard. I don't know what the context was. I think we should talk before we make any decisions. Call me back. She deleted it. She ate 3 more crackers and looked out the window at the narrow slice of street visible from her kitchen. A woman was walking a dog in the thin November light, and the dog was pulling toward something in the gutter with total conviction, and the woman was tolerating it with the resigned affection of someone who had long since accepted that this was the nature of the relationship. Madeline watched them until they were out of frame, and then she rinsed her glass and went back to bed. But Vincent Moretti was discharged from Chicago General on day 4 against the specific advice of Dr. Reyes and the specific advice of Madeline, which he acknowledged with a gravity that suggested he understood the risk and had decided the calculus pointed elsewhere. Dominic arrived with 2 men Madeline hadn't seen before, and a vehicle that was almost certainly armor-plated, and the floor went through the quiet choreography of processing a discharge that everyone understood was going to happen regardless of clinical recommendation. Madeline was finishing charts at the station when Dominic appeared at her elbow. Mr. Moretti would like a moment. She looked at him. I'm working. It'll be brief. She held Dominic's gaze for 3 seconds, then capped her pen and followed him. Vincent was dressed, which was the first significant change, dark clothes, nothing that looked like it had been brought from home in a hurry, which meant someone had thought ahead. He was standing rather than sitting, and she could see in the careful way he held his left side that the 6 he'd given her on the pain scale had probably been optimistic. But he was upright, and his color was reasonable, and his eyes were the same focused dark as they'd been from the first moment he'd tracked her across room 3. You're making a mistake, she said without preamble. Probably. He held her gaze. I need to ask you something. Ask. When you made the call on the bleed last Wednesday, were you scared? She considered that. It was not the question she'd anticipated. Yes, she said. I was. But you did it anyway. That's the job. That's not just the job, he said. That's something else. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, slowly, visibly, the deliberate movement of a man who understood what it meant to reach into his jacket in front of certain kinds of people, and produced a card, plain white, nothing on it but a number written by hand. He held it out. If you need anything. She looked at the card, then at him. I'm a nurse in a public hospital. I don't think our needs overlap very often. Maybe not. His hand didn't move. Take it anyway. She took it. She didn't know why exactly. She tucked it into the pocket of her scrubs and looked at him for a moment in the clean fluorescent light. This man who occupied space the way a weather system did, with a kind of gravity that didn't require effort, didn't announce itself, simply was. Take care of the repair, she said. If you re-bleed, I know. Moretti. She waited until he was looking at her. I worked 40 minutes on that table to keep you here. Don't waste it. Something in his face changed, just briefly. A small tectonic adjustment behind the eyes. Then, I won't. He left. She stood in the empty room for a moment after the sound of them had receded down the corridor. Then she went back to her charts. 3 weeks passed. The city did what November did in Chicago. It went gray, and then grayer, and then gray in a different way that suggested winter was not a forecast, but an arrival. Madeline worked her shifts. She reorganized her apartment, which was not the same as feeling better, but was adjacent to it. She called her sister twice and did not mention Ethan or the restaurant, because the version of events that she could explain without crying was still a work in progress. She went for runs along the lakefront when the wind permitted, and did not go for runs when it didn't, and she ate meals that were nutritionally adequate and emotionally uninspired, and she was in the specific way that people were sometimes fine. Ethan had called 11 more times. She'd answered once, on a Tuesday, from a position of what she'd mistaken for readiness. You have to let me explain, he'd said. I heard you, Ethan. You heard part of a conversation. I heard enough. Madeline. His voice shifted into the register she'd once found reassuring, the low-controlled warmth he deployed for difficult clients. I was venting. Men say things to each other that they don't. You said you never loved me. Silence. You said it like a fact, she said. Not like something you'd exaggerated. Not like something taken out of context, like a fact. That's not, don't. She was surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Don't tell me what I heard. I was standing there. I know what I heard. A pause. We're done, Ethan. We were done before I walked out of that parking lot. I'm just catching up to what you already knew. She hung up. She held the phone for a moment afterwards, sitting on the edge of her bed in the thin afternoon light, and she thought, I should feel worse than this. She thought she should be crying, or angry, or some version of devastated that felt proportionate to 3 years. Instead, she felt something that resembled, uncomfortably and precisely, relief. As if a weight she'd carried so long she'd stopped registering it as extra had been set down, and her body was only now recalibrating to what normal felt like. She didn't let herself think too hard about that. Relief felt like the wrong thing to be. It implied that some part of her had known, and if some part of her had known, then the question of why she'd stayed became one she wasn't ready to sit with yet. But the card was in the drawer by her bed. She didn't know why she'd put it there, instead of in her wallet, or on the counter, or in the recycling bin alongside the anniversary gift. She'd told herself it was practical. The number of a connected man was a resource in a city like Chicago, and she was a woman who lived alone and was not naive about the world. She believed this explanation about 60% of the time. On a Wednesday night, 3 weeks after his discharge, her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. Miss Carter. She recognized the voice immediately. Mr. Moretti. Vincent. She said nothing. I have a question, he said. How did you get this number? I have resources. That's not reassuring. No, he said. I imagine not. A pause. I have a question about the repair. There's a sensation. What kind of sensation? Pressure. Left side. It comes and goes. She sat up straighter. Sharp or dull? Dull, like a... He paused, searching, like something sitting on it. How long has this been happening? 3 days. 3 days. She worked to keep her voice level. And you waited 3 days to tell someone. I'm telling someone now. You need to be seen, today. I can get you an appointment with... I'm not going back to a hospital. Vincent, not a hospital. His voice was flat. I have a physician. I'll have him look at it. The repair needs imaging. A private physician without... He has equipment. A beat. I trust his discretion more than I trust a hospital's records. She understood what he meant. She didn't like it, but she understood it. Okay, she said. But pressure that's been building for 3 days post-vascular repair is not something you let an overextended private physician eyeball. You need someone who knows what they did to you. You know what was done. The sentence landed differently than she expected. I have the surgical notes, she said carefully. I'm not a surgeon. You're the one who made the call. You understand the repair better than anyone who wasn't in that room. Another pause. His voice, when it came again, had a different quality. Not softer, but stripped of some of its practiced neutrality. I'd like you to come. The apartment was very quiet around her. The radiator knocked once and went still. Outside, the November wind moved through the narrow channel of the street, and she could hear it against the window with the particular low note of serious cold. You're asking me to make a house call, she said. I'm asking you to look at something that concerns me. You can bill it however you want. That's not how this works. Tell me how it works. She pressed the heel of her hand against her forehead. I'd need the imaging records from the repair. I'll have everything available. Where are you? He gave her an address on the North Shore. She wrote it down without deciding anything yet, the number sitting in her handwriting on the back of an envelope, and she looked at it for a long moment. She thought about the 40 minutes in room 3. She thought about the card in her nightstand drawer and the fact that she'd put it there instead of throwing it away. She thought about Ethan's voice saying convenient and the strange, terrible accuracy of it. She thought about a man who had been shot twice and survived it, and still called her 3 weeks later because he trusted her assessment over everyone else available to him. I'll be there in an hour, she said. She pulled on her coat and grabbed her bag and took the stairs down 2 at a time, and she was 3 blocks from her apartment building in her car before she fully registered what she'd agreed to, and by then the city was moving past her windows and the address was on the envelope on the passenger seat, and there was a pressure in her own chest that she recognized as something she didn't have a clean clinical name for. She drove. She arrived at the address 45 minutes later, a property set back from the road behind a stone wall, not ostentatious from the exterior, but unmistakably built to a different set of specifications than the houses around it. A gate. A man at the gate who had her name and waved her through without a word. A long drive through grounds that were manicured even in the stripped-down November state of things. Dominic met her at the door. "He's in the study," Dominic said. "Third floor. How is he?" "He won't say." Dominic's face was its usual closed expression, but something underneath it was tight. "That's why you're here." She followed him up. The study was large and book-lined and lit by lamps rather than overheads, which gave it a warmth that surprised her. Vincent was seated in a chair near the window rather than lying down, which she registered as both good and bad. Good because he was upright. Bad because a man with a healing vascular repair was sitting in a chair rather than on a medical bed, which meant he either didn't understand the risk or understood it and had decided appearance mattered more. She set her bag down without greeting him. "Take off the shirt." He looked at her for a beat. Then he reached for the buttons. She examined the repair site for 4 minutes. Her hands were entirely clinical. The incision was healing cleanly. No signs of infection, no surface compromise. But when she pressed carefully along the line, she felt the resistance she'd been afraid of. A subtle firmness that shouldn't be there 4 weeks post-surgery. A slight asymmetry in the tissue pressure that suggested, "Have you been exerting yourself?" She said it without looking up from the site. "Define exerting. Have you been doing anything that elevates your heart rate significantly?" Silence. She looked up at him. "Vincent?" "There was a situation," he said. 4 days ago. It required my attention. A situation that required physical... A situation, he said, and his voice had gone to a place that foreclosed further inquiry. She held his gaze. "There's fluid building around the repair site. It's not critical yet. But if you don't rest, and I mean actual rest, not your version of rest, this is going to rupture. And if it ruptures outside of a hospital setting, there is a very high probability that you die." The room was very still. "How long?" he said. "Until you're clear, 6 weeks minimum, strict rest, no situations." He looked at her with something in his face that she was beginning to learn. The specific expression of a man who is doing the math on what a piece of information cost versus what it bought. 6 weeks is not available to me right now." "Then find a way to make it available, because the alternative, I know the alternative." "Then act like it." She packed her instruments back into her bag. Her hands were steady. "I'm not going to tell you how to live your life, Moretti. You've been doing it longer than I've been watching, but I will tell you that I am not going to come to this house on a Wednesday night and give you a medical assessment that you then treat as optional." Vincent looked at her. The lamplight was doing something to the angles of his face, making him look less like a crime myth and more like a man who was tired in ways that weren't purely physical. "Why did you come?" he said. The question caught her sideways. "Because you called. You could have said no." "Yes," she said. "I could have." They looked at each other in the lamp-lit room, the November dark pressing at the windows, the house around them hushed and large and populated by men who would not come through this door unless called. Something moved in the air between them. Not romantic, not yet, not exactly, but adjacent to understanding. The kind of recognition that happened between people who had been stripped of pretense by circumstances that demanded directness. 6 weeks, he said finally. 6 weeks. I'll try. Don't try. Do. The faintest movement at the corner of his mouth, that almost smile she was beginning to catalog. You always talk to criminals like this? Only the ones worth keeping alive. She picked up her bag. She was at the door when he said quietly, without the careful modulation he usually maintained, "He didn't deserve you." She stopped. The room didn't make a sound. She turned slowly. He was looking at her with the directness she was coming to expect from him. No hedging, no softening, just the plain architecture of what he meant. "Dominic," he said, answering the question she hadn't asked. "He found out. He does research when things matter to me." She absorbed that. The weight of it. The fact of being researched, known, her private wreckage quietly uncovered and examined. She should have felt violated. She was working out why she didn't.
You had me looked into, she said. Yes. That bothers me. I know. And you did it anyway. Yes. No apology in it. Just the flat acknowledgement of a man who did what he believed necessary and was prepared to be held accountable for it. I needed to know who had their hands inside my chest cavity. She held his gaze for a long moment. And now you do. I know some of it. She nodded once slowly, then she turned back to the door.
She was 3 steps into the hallway when the sound reached them. A rapid knock, then Dominic's voice from downstairs, clipped and tight. "Vincent, we have a problem." She heard Vincent push to his feet behind her, and she turned immediately. "Don't—" But he was already moving, jaw set. The 6 weeks already being renegotiated in the brutal internal arithmetic of a man who was very good at deciding what he could afford and what he couldn't, and could not afford. "Stay here," Vincent said. He said it without looking at her, already moving toward the door with the careful deliberateness of a man managing pain he refused to acknowledge as a limitation. "You just told me, Madeline." He stopped at the doorframe. His profile was sharp against the hallway light. "Stay in this room." She didn't stay in the room. She followed him to the top of the staircase and stopped there, one hand on the banister, because what she saw in the entry hall below made her understand immediately that this was not a situation her presence would improve. Dominic was there, and 2 other men, and between them, not restrained, not a prisoner, but held in the specific way that suggested he would be if he moved wrong, was a man she didn't recognize. 30s. Expensive haircut badly disrupted, jacket torn at the shoulder, a cut above his left eyebrow that was bleeding with the steady, unhurried pace of a wound that hadn't been given the chance to clot. Vincent descended the stairs. She watched him do it. The controlled pace, the left hand barely grazing the rail, the total absence of visible pain in his face, which she knew was costing him in ways the monitoring equipment would have confirmed if it were present. He reached the entry hall and stood in front of the man and said nothing. The man spoke first. "They're moving tonight." The room went still in a way that had physical weight. "Tonight," Vincent said. "The shipment changes were a distraction. The Vasquez crew has been repositioning for 3 weeks. I only just—" The man stopped, swallowed. His eyes moved to Dominic and back to Vincent. "I only just confirmed it." 3 weeks, Vincent said. His voice was very quiet. That particular quietness that Madeline was beginning to understand was not calm, but its precise inverse. "And you confirmed it tonight. I needed to be certain before I—" "Who else knows?" The man hesitated. Vincent took 1 step toward him, just one. The man's jaw tightened and he said, "Marco, he's the one who—" Another stop. He looked at the floor. "Marco's been feeding them information for 8 months." The entry hall went to a different quality of silence. Madeline watched Vincent's face from the top of the stairs. She watched the stillness move through him, the way stillness moved through a structure-absorbing impact. From the outside in, everything becoming rigid, everything locking down. Except his eyes. His eyes did something brief and unguarded that she had no name for, but it looked like the specific expression of a man who had just been handed information his body had already known and spent considerable energy refusing. Marco was the name of the man who had been seated at Vincent's bedside on the morning of day 2. The young one. Dark jacket, hands folded. She understood that without being told. "Get him out of here," Vincent said. He turned and walked back toward the stairs. She moved back from the banister before he could see her standing there. She was in the study when he came through the door. He stopped when he saw her. She hadn't gone far, hadn't pretended to have followed his instruction, was just standing by the window with her coat still on and her bag over her shoulder and her face as neutral as she could make it. He looked at her for a moment. He didn't tell her she should have stayed back. He walked to the desk and put both hands on its surface and stood there, breathing. "I should go," she said. "Yes." The pressure around the repair site. "I know. Vincent." She waited until he looked at her. "Whatever just happened, you cannot manage it the way you're thinking about managing it. Not in the next 6 weeks, not with that repair." He looked at her with something that was beyond exhaustion. "You don't know what I'm thinking. I know you well enough to know that what you're thinking involves physical exertion and probably some variety of violence,
And I know that your vascular wall is currently held together by a repair that is 4 weeks old and already showing fluid accumulation. She kept her voice even. Clinical. Because clinical was the only register she had available to her that he would actually hear. I'm telling you that the thing you want to do tonight will probably kill you. He said nothing. I need you to understand that I'm not speaking theoretically. I understand, he said. Do you? Madeline? His voice was rough. I have a man who has been inside my organization for 8 months feeding intelligence to people who will use it to destroy everything I have spent 30 years building. I have a shipment moving tonight that may already be compromised. And I have... He stopped. His jaw worked. I have men who trusted Marco. Men whose families are in those operations. I do not have the option of bed rest. She looked at him across the lamp-lit room. Then you need to delegate. Delegation requires trust. I just lost my primary inventory of that. Dominic. Dominic is 62 and has a replaced hip and is the only person in this house who I'm certain hasn't been compromised, and I need him here. She crossed the room to the desk. She stood across from him, close enough that she could see the slight irregularity in his breathing that wasn't there an hour ago, the left side moving less freely than the right, the early signature of a man whose body was beginning to send invoices for the stress it had been absorbing. She pointed at the chair. Sit down. I don't need... Sit down, Vincent. He sat, not quickly, with the controlled deliberateness of a man accepting a tactical position rather than a concession. She crouched in front of him and pressed carefully along the repair site through the fabric of his shirt and felt what she feared. The resistance had increased in the 40 minutes since she'd last assessed it. Not dramatically. Enough. Your blood pressure is elevated. Yes. The fluid accumulation has increased since I checked an hour ago. He said nothing. If you go out tonight, I know, he said. The 2 words came out like he was biting them off the end of something longer and less controlled. I know the risk. I know what you're going to tell me. And I need you to understand that there are things at stake tonight that require me to weigh that risk against other things, and sometimes the other things outweigh the risk. Your life outweighs, not just my life. He looked at her directly. There are 17 people whose primary income runs through my operations. Families. People who made choices based on a structure I told them was secure. If Vasquez moves tonight and I'm in bed while it happens, those 17 operations collapse within a week. That's not an abstraction. That's rent and groceries and a particular kind of safety that doesn't exist anywhere else for those people. A beat. So tell me again that my life outweighs the risk. She held his gaze. The lamplight was low and the room was very quiet, and the weight of what he'd said was sitting between them with the density of something real and specific. She stood up. She picked up her bag. Dominic stays here, she said. You make your calls from this room. You do not physically leave this property tonight. She looked at him. Can you work that way? Some of it. Then do some of it that way. She moved to the door. I'm leaving my number. Not the card, my actual number. If the pressure gets worse or if you develop any shortness of breath, you call me immediately. Not in an hour, immediately. Madeline, I mean it. I know you do. Something in his face had shifted. Not the almost smile this time, something quieter and harder to read. Why are you doing this? She stopped at the door. She thought about that question with the seriousness it deserved, because it was a serious question, and she was not a woman who answered serious questions with the first available thing. Because I did 40 minutes of work to keep you here, she said, and I don't like waste. She left. She drove home through the city with the heater running and both hands on the wheel and the particular quality of alertness that came from an evening that had required her to be several kinds of steady simultaneously. The streetlights were orange and cold. The lake was somewhere to her right, invisible but present, the way certain things were always present even when you couldn't see them. She was almost to her building when her phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize. She looked at it at the next red light. This is Ethan. New number. I know you've blocked the old one. I need to talk to you. It's important. She stared at it for 3 seconds. The light changed. She put the phone face down on the passenger seat and drove. She blocked the new number from the parking garage. She sat in the car for a moment after doing it. The engine still running, the heat still blowing.
And she thought about the word important and what Ethan Calloway considered important, and whether any version of that had ever actually overlapped with what she considered important. And she concluded that the answer was probably no, and that this was a thing she had known for longer than she'd allowed herself to know it. She went upstairs and slept without dreaming. 6 weeks moved differently than she expected. Not quickly. The winter had fully arrived by then, genuinely brutal, the kind of cold that came off the lake with intention, but with a kind of substance she hadn't anticipated. She worked her shifts. She ran when the wind allowed. She called her sister, and this time she mentioned Ethan, briefly and without drama. And her sister was quiet for a moment, and then said, "I always thought he looked at you like furniture." And Madeline laughed, genuinely, for the first time in what felt like a long while. Vincent called twice in the first 2 weeks, both times clinical in nature. The pressure had resolved. His private physician had confirmed it. The imaging looked acceptable. She asked the right questions, gave the right answers. The calls were brief and professionally cordial, and she did not analyze them beyond their surface. He called a third time on a Thursday evening in December. "I have a benefit," he said. "Next Saturday. The Children's Research Alliance. I contribute to their endowment." She waited. "Dominic handles these things usually. He has a broken hip currently, so he cannot." "I'm sorry to hear that. I need someone who can stand beside me for 2 hours without being afraid of the room." A pause. "I realize this is not a clinical request." She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "It's not." "You can say no." "I know I can." "Will you?" She looked at her apartment, the good morning light that was currently functioning as evening light, the herbs on the balcony that had finally given up for the winter, the chair that still had the indentation from where she'd sat during the worst of the nights after the restaurant. She thought about what it meant to be someone's convenience versus someone's choice. She thought about the difference between choosing based on fear of an empty evening and choosing based on something more honest. "What time?" she said. The benefit was at the Langham. She wore the dark green wrap dress she'd bought and saved and never used. She arrived in a car Vincent had sent, which she almost refused and then didn't, because refusing would have required a principled stand she hadn't fully formulated yet. He was waiting in the lobby. Dark suit, no tie, the particular quality of stillness she'd come to recognize from across a room. He looked at her once, briefly, in the way that was entirely different from being looked at by someone performing attention. Then he said, "You look well." "So do you," she said. "Better than the last time I saw you." "That's a low bar." "You cleared it." Something moved across his face. The evening was long and populated by the specific variety of Chicago wealth that conducted itself with practiced ease, the smooth social machinery of people who had spent decades at events exactly like this one. Madeline watched it with the anthropological interest of someone who understood the mechanism without being native to it. Vincent moved through the room with an economy that she recognized as the social equivalent of his stillness. He didn't perform at these events. He simply attended them, spoke when spoken to, listened with the attention he gave everything, and let the room orient around him the way rooms did around people who didn't require orientation. She stayed beside him because he'd asked her to, and because being beside him felt oddly like the most uncomplicated social position she'd occupied in years. Nobody asked her to be something she wasn't. Nobody performed for her. The conversations were either interesting or they weren't, and when they weren't, Vincent ended them with the clean authority of a man who had nothing to prove to anyone in the room. It was at the bar, midway through the evening, that she saw the photograph. It was in the society section of a lifestyle magazine sitting fanned out across the bar's surface, the kind of publication that documented Chicago's philanthropic circuit with the breathless reverence of a foreign correspondent. She picked it up without thinking because she was waiting for a drink and her hands needed something, and she was flipping through it with half her attention when she saw the image, herself and Vincent. Taken from across the room 10 minutes ago, both of them in profile. She was saying something and he was listening with that particular focused stillness, and from the angle of the photograph they looked like, She stopped flipping. They looked like a couple. She set the magazine down carefully. Vincent appeared at her shoulder. He followed her gaze to the magazine. She watched him register the photograph without any change in his expression, and then he looked at her, and she looked at him. and neither of them said anything about it. The bartender set her drink on the surface, and she picked it up, and they returned to the room. But something had shifted, some arrangement of interior furniture that she couldn't put back exactly where it had been. 3 days later, she came out of her building at 7 a.m. for a run and found Ethan leaning against the hood of his car across the street. She stopped on the front steps. He looked terrible, not physically. He was dressed well, coat and scarf, freshly shaved, but in the particular way that successful men look terrible when the success was being threatened and they hadn't developed the tools to manage the feeling. His eyes were doing too much. His hands were in his pockets, and his shoulders were somewhere near his ears. "I know you blocked my numbers," he said. "I'm sorry to show up like this." She stayed on the steps. "Ethan, I need 5 minutes." "I don't have 5 minutes." "Madeline." He crossed the street. She didn't move back. She held her position on the steps, which put them nearly at eye level. Up close, the terrible was more specific. He hadn't slept properly in days. Charlotte ended the engagement. She looked at him. 3 weeks ago, He stopped, ran a hand through his hair, the gesture she'd watched him make 1,000 times. The one that meant he was about to say something he'd rehearsed but wasn't sure would land. "I know I have no right to be here. I know what you heard. I know I said things that were—" He stopped again. "I've been trying to figure out how to explain it, and I can't, because there is no explanation. You heard the truth, and I can't reframe it into something else." She was quiet. The cold was serious. Her breath was misting. "I've been watching the news," he said. His voice changed quality on this. Something that wasn't quite accusatory, not quite hurt, but hovering somewhere between. The benefit photos. The magazine coverage. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had discovered that the object he'd set down carelessly was irreplaceable. "Vincent Moretti, Madeline." "Yes." "You're—" "What?" "You're with him." "That's not your business. He's a criminal. He's honest," she said. The word came out of her with more precision than she'd intended. "He told me exactly who he was from the first conversation. He has never once—" She stopped, modulated. "You don't get to come here and make this about who I spend my time with." "I'm not trying to. I made a mistake, Madeline. I know what I said. I know how it sounded. But 3 years means something, and I am asking you. You told your colleagues you never loved me," she said. "Not past tense, present. You told them you kept me around because I was convenient and available and low maintenance, and you never had any intention of building a life with me." She held his gaze. "Tell me which part of that was a mistake." His jaw tightened. "People say things not like that, Ethan. Not in that voice. Not as a fact." She came down one step. "You said I didn't fit the picture, that you needed someone who could keep pace with named partners and Hampton summers and a certain kind of life. What changed? What's different now?" He was quiet. "Charlotte's money," she said quietly. It wasn't cruelty. It was arithmetic. The engagement collapsed and the financial landscape changed, and suddenly the woman who was convenient doesn't look like a liability anymore. She looks like a safe option. That's not, isn't it? The street was very quiet between them. A car moved past at the far end of the block, its headlights sweeping briefly across the wet asphalt. His face in the cold morning light was doing the thing she'd watched it do across 3 years. The calculation, always the calculation, the rapid internal audit of positioning and exposure. "Go home, Ethan," she said. She went back inside. She stood in her hallway with her back against the door, and her running shoes still on, and her heart going at a pace that had nothing to do with exercise. She stood there for a long time. Then she pulled out her phone and called Vincent. He picked up on the second ring. "Ethan came to my building this morning," she said. No preamble. She gave it to him the same way he gave her things, plainly as information. A silence. Brief. Controlled. "Are you all right?" "Yes." She considered. "I'm fine. I wanted to tell you." "Why?" She thought about that. "Because you told me about Marco," she said. "Because you told Dominic to find out who I was before you trusted me near your recovery. And I thought that's the way this works between us. We tell each other things."
The silence on his end was different now, textured. Yes, he said. That's the way it works. Okay, she said. Okay, he said.
She hung up and pushed off the door and went to make coffee, and she stood in her kitchen in the gray December light and let herself understand clearly, without flinching, what the phone call had just been. What it meant that she'd made it. What it meant that it had felt, in the moment of making it, like the most natural thing she'd done in months. She was still standing there when her phone rang. Unknown number, Illinois area code. She answered out of habit.
Ms. Carter. The voice was male, flat, unhurried, not a voice she recognized. I'd like to speak with you about Vincent Moretti. Her hand tightened on the phone. Who is this? My name isn't important. What's important is that you understand what you've gotten yourself into. A pause, precisely timed. We've been watching Mr. Moretti's movements for several months. We know about the benefit. We know about the house visit in November. We know about the hospital. Another pause. We know about the repair. The room felt suddenly colder than it was. We'd like to offer you an arrangement, the voice continued. Something mutually beneficial. All we need from you is information. Medical information specifically. Nothing that would compromise your license under normal circumstances. The voice was smooth and patient, the voice of someone who had made this kind of call before and was familiar with the trajectory of the silence on the other end. You don't need to answer now. You have 24 hours. After that, we begin making different kinds of calls. To the medical board, for instance. To the hospital's compliance office. Regarding certain procedural irregularities on the night of November, don't call this number again, she said. She hung up. She stood in her kitchen, and the coffee was getting cold behind her, and the December light was coming through the window at its thin winter angle, and her hand around the phone was gripping it hard enough to whiten the knuckles. They knew about the house call. They knew about the repair, which meant they had someone inside the hospital, inside Vincent's household, or both, which meant that the information she carried, the surgical notes, the specifics of the repair, the timeline of his recovery, was exactly what they needed to understand the precise window in which Vincent Moretti was most vulnerable. She called Vincent before she'd crossed the kitchen. He picked up on the first ring this time. She didn't lead with context. She gave it to him in the order it had happened. The call, the voice, the specific details they'd referenced, the 24-hour window. And she did it in the clipped sequential way she relayed trauma assessments, because that was the framework her brain reached for when the situation required clarity over emotion. He was silent for 4 seconds after she finished. She counted them. Don't leave your apartment, he said. Vincent, Madeline. His voice was controlled in a way that communicated the opposite of calm. Stay inside, lock the door. I'm sending someone. Who called me? Do you know who? Vasquez. The name landed like a diagnosis. He's been trying to find leverage for 2 months. He found it. A pause that was not empty. It was dense, calculated. You're the leverage. The word sat in her stomach like something cold and heavy. How do they know about the house call, she said. Marco. He said it without hesitation, which meant he'd already done this math. Marco knew I called you. He knew you came. He gave them enough to build the rest. The hospital records are accessible to people with the right connections and enough motivation. His voice was flat with the particular flatness of a man managing rage through compression. I should have considered this. You were recovering from a gunshot wound. That's not an excuse. No, she said. It's not. But it's a reason. She moved to her window and looked down at the street. The morning was ordinary. Cars, a woman walking with a stroller, the gray sky doing what December gray skies did. Nothing that looked like a threat, which she understood meant nothing. What do they want? If they're asking for medical information, they want to know how compromised I am. Timeline of recovery. Whether the repair held specific vulnerabilities. A brief pause. What they're actually building toward is a strike window. They want to know when I'm weakest. And if I don't give them anything, they'll make the calls they threatened. Your license, the hospital compliance investigation. He stopped. She could hear him breathing, steady, controlled, the breathing of a man keeping something leashed.
And if that doesn't move you, they'll escalate to something that does. She understood what that meant without him finishing it. Okay, she said. Okay. What do you need me to do? A silence. Not hesitation. Something more like recalibration. The sound of a man adjusting to a version of the situation he hadn't fully anticipated. Nothing yet. Let me... He stopped. She heard him say something to someone in the room with him, low and rapid, not in English. Then, Dominic is coming to you. He'll be there in 20 minutes. Don't open the door for anyone else. My shift starts at 2. You're not going in today. Vincent, I have patience. Madeline? The compression in his voice cracked slightly at the edges, just slightly. I understand what I'm asking you to give up. I need you to understand what happens if they get to you before I can... He stopped again, reclamped. 20 minutes, please. She had never heard him use that word before. She thought about it for a moment. The specific weight of please in the mouth of a man who had clearly not said it often. 20 minutes, she said. She locked the door and stood in her hallway and waited. Dominic arrived in 19. He came with 2 men she recognized from the hospital, and a third she didn't, and the third one positioned himself in the hallway outside her door without being asked in a way that told her he'd done this before. Dominic came inside. His face was its usual closed configuration, but the tightness she'd seen in it the night of the Marco revelation was back, sharper now. We're moving you, he said. Where? The property. Dominic? Ms. Carter. He looked at her with the directness of a man who had been managing crises since before she was born. They have your address. They have your phone number. They have your work schedule, your hospital ID number, and the name of your charge nurse. He let that sit for a moment. This apartment is not secure. She looked at her apartment, the morning light, the dead herbs on the balcony, the chair with the indentation, the life she'd been building in the shape of temporary, waiting for something real. Give me 5 minutes, she said. Us. She didn't hear from Vincent directly for 6 hours after arriving at the property. Dominic kept her informed in the sparse, functional way he communicated everything. There were meetings, there were calls. The situation was being managed. She sat in the study on the 3rd floor, the room with the lamps and the books, and she read without retaining anything and drank coffee that went cold and watched the winter dark come down over the grounds outside. At 8 p.m. the door opened and Vincent came in. He looked like 6 hours of crisis management. Jacket off, sleeves pushed up, the particular gray quality around his eyes of a man who had been operating at a level of focus that metabolizes everything available. He sat in the chair across from hers and for a moment said nothing. She looked at the way he was holding his left side. How's the pressure? Fine. That's a lie. It's manageable. He looked at her. They called you back?
No, not yet. They will. He pressed his hands together on the desk. She noticed his knuckles were abraded on the right hand, the skin broken in a way that was fresh and not incidental. She didn't ask. I've been trying to identify the source of the leak at the hospital. It's not hospital staff. It came from Marco directly. He knew enough from the night you came here to give Vasquez a framework. Can you contain it? I've contained Marco. He said it without elaboration.
She decided not to inquire about the elaboration. Vasquez made contact with my operations at 2 different points today, he said. He's not waiting for your answer. The 24 hours was a performance. He's already moving. He looked at her steadily. He's going to take something of mine to accelerate the timeline, something I'll have to respond to regardless of strategy or recovery windows. She understood the shape of what he was telling her before he finished it. He's going to use me. Yes. He's going to take me. That's what I believe. The room was very quiet. The lamps did what they always did through the same warm, uneven light, made the room feel like a space set apart from what was happening beyond its walls. She looked at Vincent, and he looked at her, and neither of them managed it with the kind of distance the situation might have called for. You can't go out and fight a war in your current condition, she said. No. But if he takes me, you will. Yes. Simple, flat, not a threat and not a boast, just physics. She looked at her hands in her lap. That's what he's counting on. Yes. He thinks your judgment will break down if... She stopped. If he has you. Vincent's voice was even. Yes, that's the calculation.
She looked up at him. Is he right? A long pause. The honest kind. Probably, he said.
She absorbed that. The weight of being someone's vulnerability, after 3 years of being someone's convenience. The difference between those two things was not comfortable, exactly. But it was real. She could feel it in the specific way she could feel things that were true. Then we don't give him the opportunity, she said. I'm working on that. Work faster. Something moved across his face. Yes, he said. I intend to. They took her at 6 a.m. She never knew exactly how they got through the property's security. Vincent told her later, much later, that it had involved a combination of the information Marco had provided over 8 months and a coordinated distraction at the front gate that pulled 2 of the exterior men out of position for 90 seconds. 90 seconds. That was all it took. She was in the kitchen on the ground floor earlier than anyone expected her to be awake, standing at the counter with a glass of water, when the back door came in. 3 men, fast, practiced, not brutal beyond what the situation required. She didn't scream. The shock was too fast and too complete for screaming. One of them had her arm before she'd registered the door was open, and she had exactly 3 seconds of clarity in which she understood what was happening and made the assessment that physical resistance against 3 trained men in a confined space was unlikely to produce anything but injury. She stopped fighting. They put her in a vehicle. Black, no plates visible from where she was, her wrists zip-tied in front of her. In front, she noted, not behind, which meant they weren't interested in causing pain for its own sake. Professional. This was a professional extraction. She filed that away because filing things away was what she did when fear was trying to eat the available processing space. She counted turns. Left, right, straight for what felt like 8 minutes. A highway ramp. Another 12 to 15 minutes at speed. Exit, 2 more turns. She didn't know Chicago's South Industrial Corridor well enough to triangulate from the turns alone, but the highway duration suggested they hadn't left the city. The vehicle stopped. They walked her into a building that announced itself through cold and echo before her eyes adjusted to the interior light. A vast industrial space, concrete floors, the skeleton of old machinery visible in the shadows, ceiling somewhere far above where the winter light came through broken panes in a long industrial clerestory. She smelled rust and standing water and the particular blank cold of a space that had been unheated for years. Abandoned steel mill. She'd read about these. The corridor south of the loop, where the old manufacturing infrastructure had been left to dissolve slowly back into the ground over decades. She'd never been in one. They put her in a chair, zip ties stayed on. One man remained in the room with her, positioned near the door, and he didn't speak or look at her with any particular malice. He looked at her the way a man looked at an object he was responsible for maintaining in its current condition. She sat. She controlled her breathing. In for 4, out for 4. The technique she used in the ER when a case was going sideways and panic was offering itself as an option. The zip tie was tight, but not circulation compromising. She tested the tension carefully, not visibly, just the slight shift of her wrists against each other to assess the give. Very little give. They'd been thorough. She thought about Vincent, about the timing, 6 a.m., the property waking up, someone discovering the back door, the sequence of what happened next. She thought about the look on his face when she'd asked him if Vasquez's calculation was right, and he'd said probably. She thought about what probably meant in the mouth of a man who had spent decades being precisely right about precisely this kind of thing. She thought about what it meant that she was not afraid of the man by the door, that the quality of her fear was not about this room or these men, but about a healing repair and a fluid accumulation and a vascular wall that was 4 weeks old being asked to carry the weight of what was coming. A door opened at the far end of the space. A man came through it. Not one of the 3 from the house. Different. Older. Compact. With the particular economy of movement of someone who had never needed to perform authority because actual authority made performance redundant. He walked toward her and stopped at a distance that was calculated, close enough to require her to tilt her head slightly to look at him, far enough that it wasn't intimate. "Ms. Carter," he said, "I apologize for the circumstances." His voice was the voice from the phone call. "Vasquez," she said, a slight inclination of his head. "I expected you to be more frightened." "I'm frightened," she said.
I'm just not going to perform it for you. He studied her for a moment with the same quality of assessment she'd seen in Vincent, the measuring stillness of men whose survival had depended on accurately reading people. Moretti chose well, he said. I'm not a possession. No, he agreed. You're a pressure point. There's a difference. He moved to a folding chair someone had positioned nearby and sat, crossing one leg over the other with a casual precision. He's going to come here. You understand that. I understand that's what you want. It's what will happen. The wanting is incidental. He looked at her with something that was almost respectful. He knows he shouldn't. He knows the repair isn't solid, that the stress of what this will require could rupture it. He knows all of that, and he's going to come anyway, because that's who he is and that's what you've become to him. He paused. I want you to understand that clearly, because when he arrives and the situation becomes violent, I want you to know it's his choice, not mine. She looked at him steadily. You're trying to make me responsible for whatever happens to him. I'm trying to make sure you understand the stakes. I understand the stakes, she said. You want him destabilized. You want him to come here compromised and emotionally reactive because a rational Vincent Moretti is harder to destroy than an emotional one. She held Vasquez's gaze. You've done your research, but you've gotten one thing wrong. He waited. He doesn't make emotional decisions, she said. He makes decisions, and some of them happen to involve people he cares about. That's different. Vasquez looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face shifted. Not doubt exactly, but a recalibration. We'll see, he said. He left the room. On. Vincent came at midnight. She heard it before she saw it. A sound like the building's perimeter changing its nature. A series of distant concussions that the steel and concrete of the structure absorbed and redistributed as vibration through the floor and up through the legs of the chair. The man by the door straightened and pressed something to his ear, and his expression shifted from neutral maintenance to alert. And then the lights in the room cut out, and the darkness was sudden and total for 3 seconds before the emergency generators somewhere in the building's guts kicked in and threw everything into the flat yellow of backup power. Then the shooting started. It came from multiple directions, which told her it wasn't a single-point entry. Vincent had come in from at least 2 sides simultaneously, which meant he hadn't come alone, which meant he'd spent the hours since 6 a.m. building something rather than just reacting to it. The man by the door said something sharp into his earpiece and moved toward her, and she tensed against the zip tie and watched him, and made the calculation. He was moving to relocate her, not to harm her. His body language was the body language of controlled repositioning, not threat. He grabbed her arm and she went with him because the alternative was being dragged. They moved through a side door into an adjacent corridor. Longer, darker, the backup lighting here reduced to a single fixture at the far end. Her sneakers on the concrete, his grip on her arm, firm but not crushing. Behind them, the sounds of the firefight were getting closer, which meant the perimeter was collapsing inward, which meant Vincent's people were winning the outside. They went through another door. This room was larger than the corridor but smaller than the main floor. More machinery shadows. A second man was already here, standing near a far exit, and the 2 men exchanged a look and a nod, and she understood from the geometry of it that this was the contingency position. This was where they'd planned to hold her if the main floor became untenable. She filed that away too. The sounds from the main floor were changing. Fewer continuous exchanges, more isolated bursts, the acoustic signature of a fight that was contracting. She'd heard enough trauma cases come through the ER with GSW patterns to understand what a firefight sounded like when one side was losing ground. Then the door she'd come through blew open. Not with explosive force, with the deliberate force of someone who had breached it on purpose, quickly, the door slamming back against the wall with a crack that echoed in the high space. 2 men came through in the low tactical crouch of people who had trained for exactly this. She didn't recognize either of them, but they moved like Vincent's men moved, economical, unhurried, in the way that people were unhurried when they were very good at what they were doing. The man holding her arm made a decision in a fraction of a second, and she felt his grip change, and she threw her weight sideways before he could complete the decision, dropping her shoulder, driving toward the floor the way she'd never done before in her life. Some animal version of herself executing a calculation she'd never consciously run.
She hit the ground hard, shoulder and hip, the concrete unforgiving, and the zip tie caught against the floor, and she rolled and got her back against the nearest machinery and pulled her knees up. 3 seconds of controlled violence above her. She kept her head down. Something struck the concrete 2 feet from her left hand and skittered away. Then silence. Clear. A voice she recognized. She looked up. Vincent was in the doorway. Not the 2 men who'd come first. Vincent himself, behind them, having come through the moment it was viable. He was breathing hard, and his left hand was pressed against his side in a way that was not casual and not fine, and the dark fabric of his jacket in that area had a quality she recognized clinically before she registered it emotionally. He was bleeding. He crossed the room in the time it took her to get to her feet. He looked at her face first, a rapid top-to-bottom assessment, the same kind she'd run on him in room 3, checking for damage. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine." Vincent, her eyes went to his side. "I'm fine." "You are not." "Madeline." He took her face in both hands, briefly, the pressure of his palms against her jaw, his eyes on hers with a directness that had no strategy in it, and no management, and nothing held back. Just him, looking at her. "Are you hurt?" "No." Her voice was steady. Her hands had found his jacket lapel without her deciding to reach for them. "No, I'm not hurt." He exhaled. One long, controlled breath, the sound of a man releasing something he'd been carrying since 6 a.m. Then his hands dropped and his face reassembled itself, and he turned to the men behind him and began issuing instructions in a low, rapid voice. And she watched the blood spreading through the fabric of his jacket and thought about vascular walls and repair sites, and the specific cruelty of a body that had been pushed past what it had been designed to carry. She didn't ask permission. She moved to him while he was still issuing instructions and put her hand flat against his left side and felt the warmth soaking through the fabric, and the way he went briefly still under her touch, the way he always went still when she was assessing him. That particular quality of a man setting down his defenses for the duration of a specific and trusted contact. "Stop talking," she said. He stopped. Mid-sentence, without argument. She worked the buttons of his jacket with both hands, the zip tie still on her wrists making it awkward, and he reached over without being asked and snapped the plastic with a single controlled pull. Using a tool. One of his men handed him wordlessly, and then her hands were free and she opened the jacket and looked at what was underneath. The entry wound was below the old repair site by approximately 4 centimeters. A through and through, she assessed. The exit wound was behind, she confirmed by sliding her hand around his back carefully and feeling the corresponding tear in the fabric, smaller, cleaner. That was the better of the 2 available options. The bleeding was significant but not arterial. Arterial would have been faster, brighter, already on the floor. This was muscular and vascular in the secondary sense, serious and worsening, but not the catastrophic rupture she'd feared from the moment she'd seen him in the doorway. The repair site itself she could not assess without imaging and proper light and equipment she did not have. "We need to move him," she said to Dominic, who had appeared at some point in the last 2 minutes. "Vehicle is 30 seconds out. He needs a hospital." "Yes." She looked at Vincent. He was looking back at her with the focused dark eyes that had tracked her across room 3 on the first night. The same quality of attention, undiminished by pain or blood loss, or the particular exhaustion of a man who had just fought through an industrial building with a healing vascular repair. He was pale in the backup lighting. His jaw was set. He was doing the thing she'd watched him do from the beginning, absorbing what the situation cost and paying it without theater. "Don't argue with me," she said. "I wasn't going to," he said. She looked at him for a beat. She believed him. "Okay." They moved. The hospital was not Chicago General. It was a smaller facility on the north side where Dominic had clearly made arrangements in advance. The kind of arrangements that meant a trauma bay was ready and a surgical team was standing by, and the paperwork that would normally slow everything down had been handled before the vehicle arrived. Madeline had spent the drive in the back seat with her hands on Vincent's wound and her eyes on his face, and her mouth running the continuous low assessment she'd learned to give patients who were awake and stable enough to be talked to, telling him what she was doing, what she was seeing, what the plan was. Not because he needed the reassurance in the way a frightened patient needed it. but because she needed to be saying something true and useful, and because the sound of her own clinical voice was the thing keeping the other version of this. The version where she sat in this moving vehicle and understood what she was feeling and let it be as large as it actually was, at a manageable distance. He kept his eyes on her. "Stop looking at me like that," she said. "Like what?" "Like you're checking whether I'm frightened." "Am I that obvious?" "Only to me." She pressed harder on the wound and he exhaled through his nose, controlled, steady. "You're going to need surgery. The secondary bleed is going to require intervention, and they're going to want to check the primary repair while they're in there." "I know." "You understand what that means. Second surgery in 6 weeks. He was quiet for a moment. "You're going to tell me I should have rested." "You did rest," she said. "For 6 weeks you rested, mostly, which is approximately 5 weeks and 6 days more than I expected from you." She met his eyes. "This isn't your fault." Something shifted in his face. "Vasquez is handled," Dominic said from the front seat. Vincent looked at Dominic's profile. "All of it. The mill is secured, the Vasquez operations are done, our people have the confirmation." A brief pause. "It's over." Madeline watched Vincent receive that. The way it moved through him. Not relief exactly, not satisfaction. Something quieter and more complicated. The expression of a man for whom endings were never clean and victories were always measured against what they cost. He closed his eyes for 3 seconds. When he opened them, he was looking at the vehicle's ceiling. 17, he said. "Our people." "All accounted for," Dominic said. Another 3 seconds. Then something in the set of his jaw released by a fraction, just a fraction. Madeline kept her hands on the wound and said nothing. Some moments didn't need filling. The surgery lasted 4 hours. She knew this because she sat in a waiting room that was cleaner and quieter than the one at Chicago General and watched the clock on the wall with the same attention she'd given patient monitors for 6 years. And at hour 2, she called Paulette. "I need to tell you something," she said. Paulette was quiet through the explanation. The house call, Vasquez, the abduction, the mill, all of it. When Madeline finished, Paulette was silent for a moment and then said, "Are you in one piece?" "Yes." "Are you at a hospital?" "Yes." "Are you the patient?" "No." "Then I'll need you to come in tomorrow and have a very boring administrative conversation with me about protocols and documentation." A pause. "But tonight you're fine." "Paulette, Madeline." Her charge nurse's voice had the warmth underneath the authority that it always had. The warmth Madeline had relied on for 6 years without always acknowledging how much she relied on it. "You're fine. Go sit down." She sat down. At hour 4, the surgical team lead came through the door. A compact woman in her 50s with steady hands and the specific economy of expression of someone for whom good news and bad news were both delivered in the same register because both required the same thing from the person receiving them. "He's out," she said. "The secondary bleed is repaired. We checked the primary repair site while we had access, and it held. There's no compromise to the original work." She looked at Madeline with a directness that acknowledged without stating outright that she understood the nature of Madeline's presence here. "He's going to be in recovery for 48 hours minimum. After that, assuming the repair holds, we're looking at an extended but manageable recovery." "How extended?" 8 weeks. Proper rest this time." The surgical lead held her gaze. "Someone needs to enforce that." "I know," Madeline said. "Do you?" "Yes," she said. "I do, Mom." He was awake at hour 6 post-surgery. She knew because the nurse managing his recovery came to find her in the waiting room where she'd fallen asleep sideways across 2 chairs with her coat as a blanket, which she understood was not a dignified posture and did not particularly care. She followed the nurse back. The room was dim and warmer than the main floor. Vincent was propped at the standard post-surgical angle, the IV line, the monitors, the particular institutional quality of a man who had been through something significant and was in the early hours of the body's long accounting of it. He looked gray. Less gray than he'd looked in the vehicle, but gray in the specific way of someone whose reserves had been drawn on heavily. He turned his head when she came through the door. She pulled the chair close to the bed and sat. She didn't do anything with her hands. She just looked at him. "Well," he said. His voice was rough with anesthesia and exhaustion. Well, she said. How bad? Secondary repair, clean. Primary repair held. She watched his face process that. 8 weeks this time, and I mean it. I know you mean it. Do you, Madeline? He looked at her with the same eyes he'd always had. Focused, direct, nothing performed. I've been shot twice in 8 weeks. My organization just went to war. I am lying in a hospital bed for the second time this year. He paused. I think I've earned a resting period. That's one way to look at it. A silence that was comfortable in the way silences became comfortable between people who had stopped needing to fill them. Vasquez is done, he said. Dominic told me.
I want to tell you myself. He shifted slightly and she saw the cost of it in the tightening around his eyes. It's over. His operation, his people, his leverage over mine. It's finished. He looked at her steadily. You don't have to worry about the board complaint or the compliance investigation. Those calls were made from numbers that don't exist anymore. She absorbed that. Okay. Okay, he said. What about Marco?
His face went to the particular stillness it went to when certain names were raised. Marco is no longer a problem. She didn't ask more. She had learned over these weeks the specific places where her questions ended and his world continued without her, and she had made a provisional peace with the location of that boundary. It wasn't a comfortable peace. It was an honest one. He had a family, she said. Yes. They'll be provided for, Vincent said. Flat, immediate, no deliberation, as if this had already been decided. She looked at him. It's not absolution, he said. I know that. It's obligation. There's a difference. He held her gaze. I understand the difference, Madeline. She believed him. 8 weeks moved the way the first 6 weeks had moved, but with more weight to them now, the weight of what had happened in the mill, what it had cost, what it had clarified. She enforced his recovery with the same directness she'd given him from the beginning, and he accepted it with the same quality of compliance he'd always shown her. Not easy compliance, not passive, but chosen. He chose to be still because she asked him to be still, and that distinction mattered to her more than she'd expected it to. She went back to work at Chicago General 3 days after the surgery. The administrative conversation with Paulette was exactly as boring and exactly as necessary as Paulette had promised. And at the end of it, Paulette looked at her across the desk and said, You know this is complicated. I know. I know what he is, Paulette. Do you know what you are? Standing next to him. Madeline was quiet for a moment. She thought about the benefit photograph. Herself and Vincent in profile, the way the room had organized itself around his presence, the way she'd stood beside him and felt, for the first time in years, like a person occupying a position she'd actively chosen. I know exactly what I am, she said. Standing next to anyone. Paulette studied her for a long moment with the eyes of a woman who had seen everything. Then she nodded once, the decisive nod of someone filing something and moving on. Don't miss any more shifts, she said. I won't. In February, Ethan Calloway read about the Vasquez operation in the Tribune. It wasn't a front-page story. The framing was oblique, the kind of crime reporting that used alleged and sources indicate in every other sentence. But the substance was clear enough. A rival organization dismantled, a consolidation of certain business interests on the South Side. The name Moretti appearing in 3 paragraphs with the careful non-specificity of a newspaper that understood its liability limits. There was a photograph embedded in the digital version, a charity event from December, repurposed for context. Madeline and Vincent at the Langham, in profile, the dark green dress, the particular quality of his attention directed at something she was saying. Ethan sat at his desk in the office where he was no longer a candidate for named partner. The partnership track had stalled in January, for reasons that had been explained to him in the careful, euphemistic language of institutional disappointment. And he looked at the photograph for a long time. He thought about the parking lot at Arlo's, the rain, the 43 unanswered texts, the morning outside her building when she'd stood on the steps and given him the specific arithmetic of what he'd done, clearly and without cruelty, in the cold December air. You never lost Madeline to Vincent. You lost her the moment you failed to value her. He hadn't said that.
She hadn't said it. But sitting at his desk in February with the photograph on his screen, he understood it with the specific clarity that came too late to be useful, the kind of clarity that arrived only after the cost had been fully assessed and the payment fully made. She hadn't left because of Vincent. She'd been gone long before Vincent. Vincent had simply been the first person to see the space she occupied and decide it was worth something. He closed the tab. He went back to work. March came in cold and then relented slightly, the way Chicago marches sometimes did, offering brief installments of the spring that was still weeks away. The lake was still iron gray, but the light was different, longer, at a different angle, the specific shift of light that the city's residents recognized as a promise rather than a delivery. Vincent's recovery was complete by the end of February, confirmed by imaging and by his private physician and by Madeleine's own assessment, which he submitted to with the patience he'd developed over 8 weeks of having no alternative. The fluid accumulation had resolved. The primary repair was solid. Both wounds had closed cleanly. His blood pressure, for the first time since she'd met him, was within a range she could describe as acceptable without qualification. He was standing in her kitchen on a Tuesday evening in March when she told him this, delivering it in the clinical register as she reviewed the last imaging on her laptop, and he listened to the full assessment without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "So I'm healthy." Relatively. For a man who's been shot twice in the past 4 months, your cardiovascular system has performed remarkably. She closed the laptop. "Don't test it again." He looked at her from across the kitchen in her apartment in Andersonville, with its good morning light and its narrow balcony where the herbs would come back in April and its third-floor walk-up creaking slightly in the March wind. And something in his face had the quality of a man who had been looking at something for a long time and was only now allowing himself to fully see it. "I want to ask you something," he said. She waited. "I want to show you something first." He put a folder on the kitchen table. She looked at him, then at the folder, and opened it. Inside were documents, incorporation papers, property filings, financial reorganization frameworks. She went through them slowly, turning pages, understanding as she read what she was reading. The Moretti operations, the ones she hadn't asked about and hadn't needed to name, were being restructured, not cosmetically, structurally. Real estate holdings transitioning to legitimate development companies. Community investment frameworks for 3 Southside neighborhoods. A foundation, named not for him but for his mother, providing medical access funding for low-income residents in areas where the nearest ER was 40 minutes away. She looked up from the documents. "This takes time," he said. "Years, probably. It's not clean and it's not simple, and there are parts of what I've built that I can't just dissolve without consequences for the people whose incomes depend on them." He held her gaze steadily. "But this is the direction. This is where it goes." A pause. "I need you to know that before I ask you what I want to ask you." She set the papers down carefully. Her hands were steady. "Why do you need me to know it?" "Because you're a woman who saves people for a living," he said. "And I'm not going to ask you to stand beside a version of my life that runs counter to everything you are." He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and stood in front of her, close, the way he'd stood in the mill doorway, looking at her with the complete directness of a man who had run out of reasons to manage what he was showing her. "I'm not asking you to be convenient. I'm not asking you to fit a picture I've already decided on. I'm asking you to be exactly who you are, the same person who told me my blood pressure was unacceptable and that I was making a mistake and that I didn't have the option of dying on her because she'd worked 40 minutes to keep me there." His voice was even, but underneath it was something she'd heard only once before, in the vehicle outside the mill. The raw understructure of the man when he stopped managing what came out. "I'm asking you to stay." The kitchen was very quiet. The March wind moved against the window. Somewhere in the building someone was cooking, and the smell of it reached her in an ordinary domestic way that seemed strange and correct simultaneously. That the world maintained its ordinariness around moments that felt like this. She looked at him. She thought about 3 years of being convenient. She thought about standing on restaurant steps in the cold and delivering arithmetic to a man who had never actually seen her. She thought about room 3 and the 40 minutes, and the card in the nightstand drawer, and every phone call and the lamp-lit study, and the mill, and the vehicle, and his hands on her face. She thought about what it felt like to be someone's vulnerability,
rather than someone's convenience. What it cost and what it gave. I know, she said. He looked at her. I know that's what you're asking. She held his gaze. I've known for a while. And I'm still here, she said. I've been here. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached up and touched the side of her face. The same gesture as the mill, brief and unguarded and containing nothing that wasn't genuine, and she put her hand over his and held it there and let the moment be as large as it actually was, without managing it down to something more comfortable. There's something else, he said. She raised an eyebrow. I want to take you somewhere tomorrow. I've been thinking about it for a while. Where? Chicago General, he said. The ER. She looked at him. You want to go back to the hospital? The room where you worked on me is probably a supply closet or a trauma bay in rotation, and not a meaningful location to anyone but me, he said. I understand that, but I want to go back to the place where I understand what started. He held her gaze. And I want to ask you properly, in that place. Not here in your kitchen. There. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about room 3, the gurney, the monitors, the 40 minutes, the way he tracked her when she came through the door and hadn't stopped tracking her since. Paulette is going to have opinions, she said. I imagine she will. She's going to make a face. I've survived worse than faces. She looked at him for another beat, and then something loosened in her chest that had been tight for a very long time. Not a dramatic release, not the cinematic version of this moment, but the real version, the quiet internal click of something setting into place after a long period of being slightly wrong. She felt it in her sternum, in her hands, and the particular quality of the breath she drew afterward. Okay, she said. Tomorrow. They went the next morning, a Wednesday, which meant Paulette was on shift, which meant Madeline was right about the face. Paulette's face, when she saw them come through the ambulance bay entrance together, did something that moved through several distinct expressions before settling on a configuration that Madeline had never seen on it before. Something that was not quite approval and not quite amusement, and was perhaps the specific expression of a woman who had waited 20 years in an ER for the universe to occasionally deliver on its implied promises. The hospital was what hospitals were, fluorescent and purposeful, and full of the machinery of urgent need. People moved through it on the business of crisis and recovery and the 1,000 gradations between. It did not change for their presence. It continued exactly as it was. Vincent walked beside her through the corridors with the careful deliberateness of his recovery pace, which she still monitored out of habit and would probably monitor for the rest of her life out of something more than habit. They passed the nurse's station where she'd drunk bad coffee at 4 a.m. They passed the corridor where she'd leaned against the wall and let the fluorescent hum hold her up on a night that felt, from this distance, like it had happened to someone she used to know. They stopped outside room 3. It was in rotation, as she'd expected, not a supply closet, but an active trauma bay, the door slightly ajar, the room empty at this particular moment, but ready, the way ER rooms were always ready. She looked through the small reinforced window at the tile and the equipment and the lights and the exact arrangement of space where she had worked for 40 minutes on a man who had no business surviving and had survived anyway. She felt Vincent beside her, the warmth of him, the stillness. Here, he said. She turned. He was looking at her with the same directness he'd always had. No performance, no management, no strategy. Just Vincent Moretti in the corridor outside the room where she'd kept him alive, asking her something with his eyes before he asked it with words. His left hand was in his jacket pocket, and when he brought it out, there was a ring. Not elaborate, not the social performance of expensive jewelry, but specific. A thin band with a single dark stone, chosen with the same precision he applied to everything he decided mattered. I know what this costs, he said, what standing beside me costs. I know it's not simple and it's not clean, and there are parts of what I'm asking you to take on that no one should have to take on. His voice was even. Underneath it was everything she'd learned to hear underneath his voice. But I also know that you've never asked me to be something I wasn't. You treated me like a human being when the clinical calculus didn't require it. You told me the truth when it was easier to tell me something comfortable. He looked at her steadily. I want to spend whatever time I have left doing the same for you. The corridor was ordinary around them, fluorescent, purposeful. Someone's sneakers squeaking on the floor somewhere behind her, a monitor beeping in a room down the hall, the specific living texture of a place that dealt in urgent reality. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes. Yes." She held out her hand, steady, the same hand that had worked on this repair and pressed on wounds in moving vehicles and touched his face in a mill in the dark. "Put it on." He did. She looked at her hand for a moment. Then she looked at him. Something crossed his face that she had never seen on it before. The expression of a man arriving somewhere he had not been certain he would be permitted to arrive. Brief, unguarded, real in the way that only the things people couldn't fully control were real. She took his hand and they stood there in the corridor of Chicago General in the ordinary fluorescent morning and let the moment be what it was. Down the hall, Paulette appeared at the nurse's station, looked at them, looked at their joined hands, looked at the ring, and turned back to her charts with the deliberate composure of a woman who had feelings about the situation and had decided that feelings were a resource best spent elsewhere. Then she looked back one more time. Then she shook her head slowly with the faintest movement of what was unmistakably a smile. Across the city, in an office where the partnership track had stalled and February had handed him an accounting he hadn't budgeted for, Ethan Calloway saw the news item that afternoon. Not crime reporting this time. Social coverage, the kind that ran in the weekend supplement and was written by someone who found the narrative irresistible. The reformed organized crime figure and his philanthropic pivot, the foundation bearing his mother's name, the community development investments in 3 South Side neighborhoods, a photograph from the hospital taken by someone who happened to be present for reasons that would never be fully explained. Madeline and Vincent in the fluorescent corridor, hands together, her face in profile showing something unguarded and complete. Ethan looked at her face in the photograph for a long time. He thought about the parking lot, the rain, the gift she'd been carrying, the 3 years. He had told himself in the weeks after that he'd lost her to circumstances, to Moretti's world and its gravity and the specific irrational chemistry of 2 people meeting at the wrong or right moment. He had told himself that story with some success for a while. Looking at her face in the photograph, he understood clearly and finally that the story was wrong. He had not lost her to Vincent Moretti. He had set her down carelessly in a well-lit restaurant with 2 colleagues and a glass of something amber, and described her to the room in terms that revealed exactly how little he understood what he had. And she had walked out of the parking lot already gone. Not going, not in the process of leaving, but already gone. The decision already made in the arithmetic she'd been quietly doing for longer than either of them had acknowledged. Vincent Moretti had not taken anything from him. He had simply been the first person to recognize the value of something Ethan had left on the table. He closed the browser. He went back to work. He carried the understanding with him in the specific way that certain understandings had to be carried, not resolved, not absolved, just known, a permanent addition to the inventory of things a person had to live with once the accounting was complete. Spring came properly in April. The herbs on the balcony came back, which Madeline had known they would, but was still glad about. The lake changed color in the way it changed color when the light finally turned, from iron to something with blue in it, something that had the quality of possibility rather than endurance. She was working her shift on a Thursday morning when a woman came in from a car accident on Lakeshore Drive, 43. 2 children waiting outside with a uniformed officer, scared in the specific way people were scared when the injury was real, but the outcome was still open. Madeline worked on her with the same focused economy she'd brought to every patient in 6 years. She talked her through it. She held the ground between the woman and the worst possibility, and she did it without theater, without sentiment, with the plain and practiced competence that was the thing she'd always known how to give. The woman stabilized. The outcome opened in a good direction. Madeline stepped back from the bed and let herself breathe for a moment, the way she always breathed at the end of a case that had required everything. Her hands were steady. The room was ordinary around her. The fluorescent lights did what they always did, rendered the work visible and the world outside temporarily irrelevant. She pulled off her gloves and went to write it up. At the nurse's station, her phone showed a text from Vincent. 3 words, which was his preferred economy. Dinner, 7. Home. She looked at the word home for a moment, the way he'd used it without apparent deliberation, the same way he said everything he meant, plainly, with the weight it actually carried, without softening it into something easier to hold. She typed back, "Don't cook. You'll overdo it." His response came in 30 seconds. "I'll order." She put the phone down and picked up the next chart. Outside, the city was doing what the city did, enormous and indifferent, and full of the machinery of ordinary life running its ordinary course, all the emergencies and the recoveries and the things people did when they thought no one was watching, and the things they did when they knew someone was. The lake was blue today in the April light. The ER was busy. Somewhere south of the river, a foundation bearing a woman's name was processing its first round of medical access grants for 3 neighborhoods that had been waiting a long time for someone to look in their direction. Madeline Carter worked her shift. She was good at her job in the way that some people were good at things, not because she'd chosen it, but because it had chosen her, because the work had revealed to her the version of herself that functioned most completely, that operated without the self-management and careful calibration she'd once applied to everything else. She was not trying to earn anything. She was not making herself convenient for anyone. She was simply here, in the fluorescent ordinary of a Tuesday ER, doing the work. And at 7 o'clock she would go home and sit across from a man who had spent 6 months learning her actual dimensions and deciding they were exactly what he wanted, and they would eat takeout at a kitchen table and talk or not talk, and she would check his recovery stats out of habit, and he would let her because he had learned that letting her was a form of love rather than a concession, and the city would do what the city did outside the windows, and she would be simply, quietly, entirely loved, for the first time in a long time. Not despite who she was, because of it.